right, Carlton King is a former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for special branch in the jihadi organisation.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of national security, secret intelligence, and armed governmental personal protection operations. But actually, what every listener now knows, and you should subscribe so you know, is that we actually look at geopolitics in the round, be that in the macro or the micro. Reasoning? Dead simple. What we want to do on this show is to keep you informed, to let you listen to the evidence, listen to information that you hardly ever get anywhere else, definitely not on the mainstream mass media. And then we want you to make your own decisions. So this episode is part 2 of an episode that I started last week, which was basically looked at whether Germany is collapsing at a rapid rate and why that's the case. So I'll basically articulate that to you as we go along. I'll also play for you some clips from other shows or clips that other individuals have said, so you can understand where Germany is now as opposed to where Germany was some several years ago, and why I believe Germany is falling foul of its one-time practically unstoppable success. So without further ado, let's get into it. I'm now going to play you something which at first hearing you might not think is significant. But when I explain it to you, you will understand the absolute significance of this vis-a-vis Germany and its position within the world, not now just within the West. Because too often we think of the world in the West as just the West. That's not the world. And as we move along in this 21st century, the West is becoming less and less the arbiter, the portrayer of what the world is. And other parts of this planet are beginning to actually set the direction for what the world is. Remember, if you'd come to this planet 2,000 years ago, you would have thought that Africa was the leader in the world, let's say 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, because ancient Egypt would have been the number one thing on the planet. Then, if you'd have come a little bit later, you'd have seen that West Asia and Africa, taking into account Egypt, which is still powerful, was one of the most powerful places on earth. In both periods of time, by the way, China would have been powerful. And then you had a period of European orientation, albeit that the peoples that created things like ancient Rome and Greece were not today what we would just call Europeans. Oftentimes they were Afro-Europeans, Afro-Asians, Europeans, etc., who were controlling this. Then we had a period of the time when, various places around the world had some power, be it in Africa, Asia, or be it in the Americas. And then came the time of European expansion in terms of its maritime power, which basically, an industrial revolution, which basically changed the world to the way we now understand it, or did understand it not that long ago, because of the fact that it was the the last movement, if you will, towards an understanding of the world. And more importantly, because of the British Empire, what you did have was Britain's view of the world being basically usurped on top of every other view of the world to every other part of the world nigh on. And that being then perceived as the culture of the world. But that's changing rapidly. So we're going back to some of the old-fashioned systems, back to countries that have been powerful once and are now being powerful again, be it those in West Asia, be it those in the Far East, in East Asia, be it those in North and Mid to Central Africa, maybe even South Africa to some extent, be it those to some states which are moving along in, if you will, the southern Americas. I don't mean South America, I mean South America rather than the southern states of the United States. Obviously, the United States is still there as a great power. Obviously, Europe still has a powerful aspect to it, but it is by no means now universal. And I think that's what we need to understand. So please listen to this and understand how Germany, again, is overplaying its hand.
As Europe pushes to cut its dependence on Russian energy, a growing divide is now opening inside the European Union itself. Slovakia is openly accusing major EU powers of double standards, questioning why countries like France, Germany, and Spain continue importing large volumes of Russian gas, while smaller nations face political pressure for doing the same. The criticism strikes at the core of Europe's energy strategy, exposing tensions over whether the bloc is truly united in its efforts to isolate Moscow. Slovak officials argue that some of Europe's biggest economies are quietly maintaining the very ties others are being told to abandon. The dispute is now fueling fresh cracks inside the EU, as the battle for energy security becomes increasingly political. Speaking in Bratislava, Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico thanked European Union institutions for helping restore flows through the Druzhba pipeline, but immediately followed that by attacking what he described as blatant hypocrisy inside the bloc. What are the Spanish, the French, and the Germans doing? Fico asked. They are buying liquefied natural gas from Russia in volumes like never before. The Slovak leader rejected accusations that Slovakia was helping finance Russia's military by continuing Russian energy imports, arguing that Western European countries themselves remain deeply dependent on Russian LNG, despite publicly supporting aggressive energy sanctions. So that's fine. They can, but you Slovaks cannot, he said.
And please, let's stop beating ourselves up over this gas and oil. I consider it a great success. I thank the Madam Vice President for the reopening of the Druzhba pipeline. What have we been working on together? But let's stop beating ourselves up. I reject the argument that by buying Russian oil and Russian gas, we are financing the Russian military machine. And then what are the Spanish, the French, and the Germans doing who are buying liquefied natural gas from Russia in volumes like never before? There's a sharp increase in the import of liquefied natural gas from the Russian Federation into Europe. So that's fine. They can, but you Slovaks cannot. That is financing the machine. Even though, given the circumstances or the total revenues that Russia has from the sale of these raw materials, it is a negligible amount.
Fico's comments expose one of the EU's most uncomfortable realities. Even after years of sanctions and political confrontation with Russia, Europe still continues importing significant amounts of Russian energy, particularly liquefied natural gas shipped by sea. According to recent trade data, France has emerged as the EU's largest importer of Russian LNG, followed by Belgium and Spain. That has increasingly fueled criticism from Central European governments, which argue Brussels is applying stricter political scrutiny to pipeline-dependent Eastern members, while wealthier Western states quietly continue large-scale purchases through maritime LNG terminals. The dispute intensified after the Druzhba pipeline, which transports Russian crude oil through Ukraine towards Slovakia and Hungary, was shut for nearly 3 months earlier this year. Ukraine blamed the disruption on damage caused by drone strikes, but both Slovakia and Hungary accused Kiev of intentionally slowing repairs for political leverage. The standoff escalated into a broader diplomatic clash involving Bratislava, Budapest, Brussels, and Kiev. Officially, the EU continues moving toward a complete phase-out of Russian fossil fuels, with plans to eliminate Russian LNG imports by the end of 2026 and pipeline gas by 2027. But in practice, many European economies remain structurally tied to Russian energy flows, especially liquefied natural gas cargoes that are harder politically to track and restrict than direct pipeline imports. Fico is increasingly positioning himself as one of the loudest European critics of what he sees as selective enforcement inside the bloc. And his latest remarks reflect a broader frustration growing across parts of Central Europe. While Brussels publicly promotes unity and sacrifice against Moscow, the economic burden and political expectations are not being shared equally across the European Union.
So, if we just take the issue of who in the European Union is actually taking on board Russian oil in whatever format, Russian oil and gas in whatever format, be it as liquefied natural gas or be it coming out of a pipeline, we can see that the bigger countries pretend they don't know where the oil's coming from, but utilise it, whilst the poorer countries have to actually acknowledge that they're getting it directly, particularly Eastern Bloc ones, getting it directly from Russia, and therefore take a hit every time they do that from others within the European Union. Secondly, you can also see that the cost of this gas which they're getting and this oil which they're getting, be it via India or indeed be it that they don't use Russian gas that has been converted by the Indians or just renamed by the Indians and actually use American LNG, which is 3 times the cost of what the Russian one was. Americans are rubbing their hands together saying, brilliant, we're selling our gas because we're not allowing the Germans to buy it from the Russians. And therefore, they're making a pretty penny, thank you very much. So you see, this whole thing has got out of hand. Now, let's look a little bit closer again at this whole issue.
Fresh trouble for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. This as 3 European nations, Hungary, Slovakia and Serbia, join hands against Kiev's energy blackmail. The center of the storm is Druzhba oil pipeline, which serves as the primary conduit for Russian crude deliveries to Hungary and Slovakia. Shipments through the pipeline have stalled since the end of January. Ukraine said the pipeline suffered damage in Russian attack, but Kiev has not made an official announcement about resuming oil deliveries. Remember, Hungary and Slovakia are among the last remaining customers of Russian oil within the European Union. The halt in energy supply made a big geopolitical shift. Hungarian's MOL has taken the acquisition of a controlling stake in Naftna Industria Serbia, NIS, from Russia's Gazprom. Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó said that the move will help Budapest, Serbia and Slovakia to resist energy blackmail from none other than Ukraine. A day after the European lawmakers praised Zelensky and slammed Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban during an event marking 4 years of war in Ukraine, Szijjártó met with Serbia's Minister of Mining and Energy, Dubravka Đedović-Handanović. Szijjártó and Handanović met in Washington, where they took part in an international conference on energy cooperation between the United States and Eastern European countries.
So it's not overplaying one's hand to suggest that the Ukraine situation could in itself destroy and cause fizzes in the European Union that cannot be fixed, and we could thereby have various other smaller Brexits from the Union as a result of the war in the Ukraine. Let's listen on.
4 years of empty rhetoric, 20 separate rounds of self-destructive economic decrees, and the grand illusion of a unified European front has officially collided with a wall of cold, unyielding reality. In a humiliating diplomatic retreat exposed by Politico, EU officials have quietly admitted that a full, total ban on Russian oil imports has been completely dumped from the upcoming 21st sanctions package. Despite months of desperate posturing by hawkish Baltic states demanding a total blockade, Brussels has been forced to wave the white flag. The reason? The absolute dependency of European industries on cheap, high-quality Russian energy. Instead of an embargo, European bureaucrats have been reduced to shuffling papers, proposing toothless corporate-targeted restrictions on Rosneft and Lukoil that do absolutely nothing to stop the steady, profitable flow of Russian crude across the continent. The absolute failure of the EU's economic strategy is rooted in pure hypocrisy. Brussels claims these targeted corporate listings are a surgical strike, but in reality, they are desperate face-saving loopholes designed to keep European lights on. Central European nations, completely dependent on the landlocked Druzhba pipeline, flatly refuse to commit economic suicide to satisfy a political narrative from Brussels. They made it clear that any attempt to enforce a total cutoff would result in an immediate veto, paralyzing the entire sanctions apparatus. Furthermore, major maritime nations within the bloc aggressively tanked proposals for a total shipping ban, terrified that their maritime revenues would instantly evaporate to non-EU competitors. Europe wanted a total war, but when the bill arrived, they realized they couldn't afford it. While Moscow continues to effortlessly log record-breaking energy revenues by redirecting its maritime trade to insatiable markets in Asia, the European Union has successfully managed to sanction itself into a corner. By cutting off cheap Russian pipeline gas and failing to ban Russian oil, Europe has succeeded only in forcing its own citizens to buy the exact same Russian molecules through third-party intermediaries at triple the price. The resulting wave of inflation has triggered mass political instability, fracturing the alliance from within. Ultimately, the omission of the oil ban from the 21st package proves that Europe's attempt to dictate terms to a global energy superpower was a historic act of hubris. 4 years into this conflict, Russia's economy is stronger, more resilient, and completely insulated from Western pressure. Meanwhile, Brussels is left managing a fragmented, hyperinflated bloc that is forced to quietly beg for Russian resources through legal loopholes just to survive the winter. The 21st sanctions package was supposed to be a demonstration of Western strength. Instead, it has stood as an official historical monument to Europe's total economic surrender.
And just as you maybe thought things couldn't get any worse for Germany as the undisputed leading light of the EU, and the problems of the EU splitting under the German politician van der Leyen, you then get an absolute hit on Germany in the UN.
The 86th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. The Assembly will proceed to the election of 5 non-permanent members of the Security Council to replace the members whose term of office expires on December 31st, 2026, under sub-item B of agenda item 113. The 5 outgoing non-permanent members are Denmark, Greece, Pakistan, Panama, and Somalia. These 5 states are not eligible to be re-elected today. Their names, therefore, should not appear on the ballot papers. Apart from the 5 permanent members, the Security Council will include the following states in 2027: Bahrain, Colombia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Latvia, and Liberia. The names of these states, therefore, should also not appear on the ballot papers. Of the 5 non-permanent members which will remain in office in 2027, 2 are from the African states, 1 is from the Asia-Pacific states, 1 is from the Latin American and Caribbean states, and 1 is from the Eastern European states. Pursuant to paragraph 3 of Resolution 1991A of the 18th session of December 17th, 1963, the 5 non-permanent members should be elected according to the following pattern. 2 from the African and Asia-Pacific states, 1 from the Latin American Caribbean states, and 2 from the Western European and other states. The ballot papers reflect this pattern. For the 2 vacant seats from among the Western European and other states, 3 candidates have been communicated, namely Austria, Germany, and Portugal. In accordance with Rule 92 of the Rules of Procedure, we shall proceed now to the election by secret ballot. Group A, African and Asia-Pacific states, 2 seats. Number of ballot papers, 191. Number of invalid ballots, 1. Number of valid ballots, 190. Abstentions, 0. Number of members present and voting, 190. Required 2/3 majority, 127. Zimbabwe, 182. Kyrgyzstan, 105. Philippines, 85. Group B, Latin American and Caribbean states, 1 seat. Number of ballot papers, 191. Number of invalid ballots, 0. Number of valid ballots, 191. Abstentions, 9. Number of members present and voting, 182. Required 2/3 majority, 122. Number of votes obtained, Trinidad and Tobago, 181. Guyana, 1. Group C, Western European and other states, 2 seats. Number of ballot papers, 191. Number of invalid ballots, 0. Number of valid ballots, 191. Abstentions, 1. Number of members present and voting, 190. Required 2/3 majority, 127. Number of votes obtained, Portugal, 134. Austria, 131. Germany, 104. Having obtained the required 2/3 majority and the largest number of votes, Austria, Portugal, Trinidad and Tobago, and Zimbabwe are elected members of the Security Council for a 2-year term beginning on January 1st, 2027. Having obtained the required 2/3 majority and the largest number of votes, Kyrgyzstan is elected as a member of the Security Council for a 2-year term beginning on January 1st, 2027. I congratulate the states which have been elected members of the Security Council today, and I thank the tellers for their assistance in this election.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, that which you may not have understood is a massive change and actually plays into today's process in terms of what I'm trying to get over to you in the decline of Germany. So basically, since the Security Council has been so voted for, because Germany is not a permanent member, neither is Japan, due to the fact that they're involved in the Second World War, and the punishment for them when in 1947 the new system was being brought into place about how the world will run itself politically. The permanent members of the UN, which is what was being voted for there, although they were the rolling permanent members, as it explained, you'd only have 2 years in the role. But on the Security Council's position there, it's a very powerful position, which is why you heard all the clapping and all the shouting and all what was going on. It means that you can affect how the security of the world functions. So the permanent members who are always sitting as permanent members at the UN and are always sitting on the Security Council are the United States, the United Kingdom, China, Russia, now that the Soviet Union is disbanded. And so what you have is that these powers then dictate what happens in the world, and they can veto any security position. And I forgot to mention France. So, and those are the victors of the Second World War. So they can basically say to any situation, any political, any geopolitical situation that comes across the desk of the UN, which is everything, effectively, any position whereby, example, let's say 242, the UN's General Assembly's position on the agreement 242, which is that Israel should not take over the occupied territories, should have the agreement whereby there are two states in one particular area, one being Palestine, the other being Israel, Jerusalem being the joint capital of them both, etc., etc. That is not in any way, shape or means brought into being, because as soon as that comes up, the United States vetoes it, and as a general rule, so does the United Kingdom, and that means it can't go through. End of story. Bosh. Finished. Even if the other countries all supported it. But the power of these non-permanent members is that on other issues that are not so contentious to the 5 permanent members, they can direct their political positions onto those things that come forward. Now, Germany has for the last 40-odd years, 48 years, maybe even longer, always had one of the non-permanent seats. Always been voted in under the Western European. Always been voted. And, one could argue that's right, because it is by far the most powerful economic, and some might even say military, albeit they never used their military before, in terms of numbers, country in the West, in Western Europe. And that includes the United Kingdom. Don't fool yourself. The United Kingdom economically is nowhere near on a par with Germany. So, in other words, you want to look at the GDP, it's about $1 trillion less than Germany's GDP is for us. So therefore, Germany's about 4 trillion, we're about 2.9, 3.1 sometimes, up fluctuating. So therefore, and I should argue we're about the same as France. So just so we get the conceptual position right when you're thinking about it, about what our GDP is, our gross national product, the amount of money that we're meant to earn. So, Germany's by far ahead of us. So this is powerful. Germany hasn't made it. And one can argue the reason why Germany hasn't made it is the things that they are doing now under the new Bundeskanzler Merz. You know, people don't like the idea that Germany is pushing out as a military power. And I'm saying, when I say people, I'm saying states around the world don't like it. They don't like the idea that Merz starts saying, we're going to build our army up and we're going to take on Russia, blah, blah, blah. They don't like it. Now, people in the European Union might think they do because, unfortunately, a la Piers Morgan, they begin to think that the only part of the world is Western Europe and America, right? That's not reality. Or even just the EU, including the United Kingdom, if you want to add to it Western Europe, and America. No. The vast majority of people in this world today, okay, of the 8 billion people, 7 billion of them sit outside of that particular enclave of individuals. And they don't like the idea of what's going on. And this is the war that Russia's winning. Okay? This is the war that China is winning. Right? People are not saying it, but this is the war of minds. So it's winning the war of hearts and minds of the peoples outside of Europe and America. Not the Americas, America. Not necessarily even North America, but yeah, I'd say Canada and the United States. But definitely, you start going southwards, you know, from Central America, from Mexico onwards, actually, the countries that the United States starts calling negative, Iran or whatever, I'd leave North Korea off that, because I think the North Korean position for most countries is a position that most countries don't sit to, right? But definitely, you put Iran in there, and a lot of countries start saying, yeah, very good, they're standing up for themselves. They're standing up for themselves. And you can see that when you get amongst the people in these lands, or you listen to or you read what the people of these lands are saying. Even some of the governments may be saying something different because, of course, they've got fear against the United States coming at them. But the reality is that the people on the ground are actually seeing positive towards Iran, a positive towards, for sure, China, a positive towards Russia. And so this vote has just shown that, which is why I wanted you to understand that, and why you see all the whooping and the hollering that came about. And the two countries that have actually got it within the Western Europe fold, I would suggest that if Spain would have put itself forward in the same way that Spain probably would have got it, but Portugal's got it, because those countries are beginning to show a more outward perspective. You know, Austria, for most people around the world, isn't perceived as necessarily negative in any way, shape or means. It's perceived as neutral, non-aligned, which it is, and therefore people think, yeah, Austria, okay. And Portugal is now, you know, its colonial past has gone, is now being perceived by many as, you know, more in tune with the global south, if you will, to use that terminology, anything east of Western Europe, with the global south, and more in tune with that. And so you can see that not only were, frankly, the Portuguese shouting, hollering, maybe even non-diplomatically, but also were many other countries were applauding, really applauding that vote. This is where Germany has fallen to. This is where Germany now is. And I want to look at a little bit more on the economic factor of Germany, in addition to what I've just now played you in terms of oil and gas, how that has functioned. and how that actually, frankly, has destroyed German economy. Because you may not know that under Angela Merkel, when she was the Bundeschancellor, doing a deal with the Greens, Germany said that it would get rid of its nuclear power, i.e. the nuclear power stations which were providing some of the cheap energy for Germany. They'd do away with it. And they did away with it for political reasons, and they've done that. But of course, the replacement at the time was, frankly, very, very cheap Russian gas, which Germany actually sold on a portion of that to other countries, going through the Nord Stream pipeline example. When the United States blew that pipeline up, then, of course, that cheap oil, cheap gas had gone, no longer available, and German industry started to pay for it. Now, you'll hear a lot of people who I even respect. So Colonel McGregor, example, who's very, very good on the Ukraine war, very, very good on the United States expansionist perspective, very, very good on other. He tends to blame Germany's wars on migration. Well, the reality of the situation was, having lived in Germany for many, many years and seen inward flow migration into Germany, which always was the case, at one stage as Gastarbeiter, so guest workers who had a period of time that they could work for, which actually extended to never leaving because people had children. The reality for Germany was one simple truth. Post the Second World War and the Wirtschaftswunder, so the economic wonder that Germany had, one of the things that Germans took away from that was basically that if you wanted to have economic success as a German family, you kept your numbers of children down. And it's at such a level now that Germans on average, and I don't know if it's even possible, have something like 0.8% of a child. So they needed population, because the older the German older population got, the less people there were to pay into the kitty to give, or to continue to give Germany its outstanding health system, its outstanding economic system, its outstanding welfare system. Okay, so it needed people in there. And the way that Merkel fought to do that in the latter years of the 90s and even earlier 80s, but the way it was being done even prior to that were that you had brought in guest workers, oftentimes from places like Turkey. Then you had a whole host of Brits going over there, again as short-time workers or weekday workers, where they worked on the building sites when Germany was rebuilding its situation. You had loads of Brits, particularly from up north, during the Thatcher era, when there was no work in Britain. These guys were going across to Germany during the week, building, coming home at weekends, sometimes staying there. But, they were term workers. They weren't there for to live the whole time, because oftentimes they didn't integrate themselves into society. The Brits never learned the language of the Germans as a general mass. As a general mass, I can tell you that. I mean, the average Brit did not learn the language, and did not get amongst the German people. But he did work on the sites and did enough, or understood maybe just enough to work the sites, the building sites. But oftentimes, because English is the lingua franca, it's the language used around the world, the Germans communicated with the Brits in English, so therefore they didn't need to learn. So that's what was going on there. But the salaries were great and people kept going over. Auf Wiedersehen, Pet. You've seen it on television if you're in Britain. You've seen it. It's absolutely as it was. That's a very realistic position as to how it was. So that's how they were working through that system, by utilising foreign workers, oftentimes from within Europe, sometimes from without, as I said, with Turkey. But then that wasn't working because there were other opportunities for workers from elsewhere, and workers want to generally go to a land where they speak the language. Now, the German colonies in Africa and a small amount in Asia had German-speaking Africans and to some extent Asian, small amounts. But those had gone some time ago, and some of the people in those colonies, let's take for instance if you look at Tanzania in the old days, they had to relearn to learn English. So then English became a language. So if a Tanzanian person wanted to move somewhere, as a general rule, they turn around and say, well, I'll go to England because I understand the language. I was part of the British Empire post the German defeat of the First World War. So you see, that's the kind of issue. I mean, Namibia probably was the place where, not probably, was exactly the place where you'd find, Africans going to Germany from Namibia because they're still speaking the German language, right? So that's where you get that, in addition to their own languages, of course. The German language is used there in that land as a lingua franca. So, and for many other countries, you'd find that. So Germany became a choice potentially to make money, but it didn't become a choice to live for many people because you had to learn the languages, and it's a difficulty. Now, you could get away with English, of course, like the English were doing, but if you're trying to build a life there, it's much more difficult. You want to learn the language. So and the language is difficult. So that's the problem. But how do you get past that? What you do is you bring in migrants who are refugees from other lands, who either can't go back or don't wish to go back to their land. Many of them are educated and have been driven out by whomever. You used to find this with a lot of Iraqis, a lot of Iraqi doctors, dentists, whatever, who are over there. So who happen to be Iraqi Kurds. So you'd bring these people in, and they'd bring then subsequently with them their families, educated, got into the jobs field, worked within Germany, and became German citizens. So, but you'll find that many people start saying, oh, that's the fall and the loss of Germany, that's where the money's gone. Rubbish. That was a requirement to get the skills assets in, even if they are low-skilled assets in, because you needed the populace of young people that Germany was not producing. We know it from Western Europe in general. Britain isn't producing the numbers of youth that you required, which is why we also were happy. You'll never hear people say it, but we're happy to bring people. This is why when in the EU the accession states came in, and they said, and that what I mean by that is Eastern European states came in, and they were allowed to come in the 2000s into the European Union. There was a moratorium on these individuals coming into higher European countries for 8 years, sometimes extended out. It was a moratorium. Britain, unlike other countries, said, no, we'll allow Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Lithuanians, the whole gambit of those who entered under the accession states. We'll allow them into our country from day one. They can come to Britain from day one. So Britain got a massive number of Eastern Europeans in because it needed basically young people to work the British system. It needed them. And with the Brexit vote, because they can move around from place to place, unlike, say, a migrant coming from Africa or Asia or Latin America, when the Brexit vote happened and they felt the cold wind of we don't like foreigners, many of these left from the NHS, left from various other tasks that they may have, high or low tasks, it doesn't matter. They left. Builders, people working in the banking system, wherever. They said, look, I'm mobile. I can go elsewhere. And they fired off and went elsewhere. And so this is the big difference that sort of mobile European union type individual has that other migrants don't have. And so, I said, and people can go back to one of my earliest, if you want to put it that way, earliest podcasts, when I did a 20-minute long pod, and I explained that if we leave the European Union in Brexit, you will see many, 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 many more migrants from Africa and Asia. Many more migrants from Africa and Asia, because we need the people. No matter how you spin it, we need the people. We need the young people. We need them to work our system in the United Kingdom in order for the United Kingdom to function. Now, your Farages aren't going to tell you that. I don't know if your Tommy Robinsons know that. Don't know if they're educated to it. Maybe they is, maybe he isn't. But the reality is that's what we require. But the problem is nobody tells you that. So that's why you have people out on the street now complaining too many migrants, when actually they require the migrants. Now, they don't necessarily want them coming in via boats, but that's only a trickle. That's like 0. I think it's something like at the maximum 0.2% or 2%, let's argue. I think it's even less than that of migration. You know, the vast majority of migrants are coming in totally legally to work in the country, which we require. And there's many areas of our industrial, agricultural, financial and economic system in which we need people, right? And not necessarily people that you would automatically think are skilled. So, example, agricultural workers, people who are going to graft hard, that Britons don't want to do. But Britons don't need to do, frankly, because they're going to get Social Security. So why would you graft hard from 4 o'clock in the morning in the field until something like, 5 o'clock in the afternoon? Why would you do that? You don't want to do that, so you don't do it. So you see, that's why individuals are needed. And even if you changed it around and give better employment law, you still have a problem because Britons have got used to, frankly, something for nothing. So, but the anger is pushed in the other direction. The anger is pushed in the direction of, oh, these fellas are taking our jobs. When you offer those jobs to the people, they don't want those jobs because they see themselves doing another job. So it's an easy scapegoat, in other words. And we all know it. We all just pretend that it isn't. That's all we're doing. And so I'm looking at Germany because Germany's got this problem too now. The AfD's coming up and its wars, which are really wars have come about as a general rule as a result of Germany's poor economic orientation, particularly in the last 4 years since this war against Russia. But it's also been some other aspects that Germany's put in place that have not been positive as to how it could function. But it's done that at the detriment of its economic success. One of those things is, to be quite fair, in the past, if you look to the 80s and 90s, the spread of wealth amongst the German populace, and by that I mean everybody working in that country and in it, was actually quite, how would one put it, quite uniform amongst all the people. There weren't, like you have in the United States, the massive highs of the 1% and the 25% in abject poverty nearly in the United States, and then that middle class that they have, which suffers if 2 paychecks don't come in. Okay, there wasn't that in Germany. There is now, not to the level of the United States, probably more to the level of Great Britain. Because we've always had that, but we built that into a class system, and oftentimes the British people accepted that in line with their class. But, in Germany, that class system, which they had, was basically beaten out of them in the First World War. After the First World War, you make you aware, then after the Second World War, even more so. So that class system was beaten out of them. And what you would have is you'd have the high and the low. Oftentimes, so if you went to a factory example in Germany and you were working there, or any business to be fair, whereas in Britain you might have 4 or 5 different canteens for the level of worker, in Germany you'd have one. The boss would sit in the same canteen, so therefore it's nice, very nice, because he's sitting in the same as his lowest workers are. And therefore his lowest workers felt that they were part of the company, they were part of the firm. You had the system, which I thought was a fantastic system, of the Works Council. Right? The Works Council system whereby you had, representatives from the workers sitting on the board, and you couldn't fire Germans without representatives of the workers saying, yeah, you can fire that person, because when we've looked at it all, it's not just unionised, it's how the system worked within the Works Council. So yes, oftentimes unionised, but the point is it was sensibly unionised as a general rule. And if a worker wasn't pulling his or her weight, right, that Works Council weren't saving them, because they were looking at the overall position of the company. Because at the end of the day, the company paid their salary very well, thank you very much, generally a 13-month salary, Christmas bonus and holiday bonus, etc., etc. And they didn't want to jeopardise that. This is regular workers. They did not wish to jeopardise that. So that is why there was a big difference in the way that Germans functioned. Now, unfortunately, coming to the end of Angela Merkel's system, she started to change some of that around, following this American winner-take-all type model, because she thought that Germany was falling behind slightly. And the price to be paid for that, and I'm not putting it all at Merkel's door because I think she was brilliant, the people who came subsequent to her, be they from the left or Schultz, or from the right, like this guy you got in now, Merz, either way, have knackered the thing. But the biggest catalyst for that knackering was the war with, effectively, Russia. And you hear what I'm saying? The war with Russia. So Germany at war with Russia, the same way as the United Kingdom is, and the same way that France is. Okay? So that's been a problem. And the European Union, which basically was always a German baby. Germany put most of the payment up for the European Union. Most of the concepts of the European Union were German, etc., etc., etc. Right? Because Germany was by far the most powerful. So there you go. Right? So the European Union orientated its activity towards a German perspective, and particularly when you got a German woman in it. But then it started to move away. And my thoughts are that it became an American baby for reasons that one can guess, when the leadership were people who had worked many years in America, who were American-orientated, like Merz is, American-orientated, and functioned in an American way rather than a German way. Okay? So in a pure capitalist way, rather than in reality what the German system was, a socio-capitalistic system. That's basically what it was. Be that a Christian a socio-capitalistic system, or be that just a socio-capitalistic system without any Christian elements to it. And I mentioned the Christian aspect because that probably in Bayern in Bavaria, it's called in Bavaria, that had more of a Christian conservative aspect to it, but was still socialistic in many of its processes. But a lot of that now has been taken from it. And I think that this is one of the problems of Germany. I think Germany has forgotten its vow to the people of Germany. So what I want to do is just finally play you a couple of last clips, which will relate to the fall of the German economy. So you can get a feel for how the German economy has fallen from its heights. I've given you my feel as to why, and I've also put in the United Kingdom's perspective, because the reality of it is that most of Western Europe is going through this in differing ways. And I think, my personal view, okay, so it's my opinion now, my personal view, probably not heavily evidenced, but it possibly is. I think that what's happened is now, for what I would call the political class, the people who run the countries, the political class has now become a fiscal political class. And what I mean for that is Germany was always known for its capacity to build and make and create something. okay? Cars, white goods, massive engineering tasks, etc., etc. And yes, cheap energy is required for all of these things, which is why it's fallen down. But, and this is the but bit that I'm going to put in there, the politicians oftentimes were not part of that. The politicians, and I think you can go, you can go all the way back and then move forward from Willy Brandt to Schmidt to Schroeder to, you can mention most many of them, although Schroeder started dipping his toes in. But what happened is with the political class then became a fiscal class. So they saw that money, as in the United States, money was being made by the vast majority of the wealthiest people in the United States, not because of what they built or created, but because of how they played a stock market. This creation, if you will, this joint creation. Can I go as far as say joint? I probably can. Of the voodoo economics of Ronald Reagan and the economic wonder of Great Britain's city expansion of the 90s under Thatcher, 80s, 90s. The boom years, everything sold off, everything bought, water, gas, British Telecom, you name it, all sold off, and people making money, not on the product, but making money on the gamble that it would make money on the stock market. That gamble, which led to short-termism in the city and therefore made Britain even less competitive, because if it didn't make money quickly, it wasn't of any interest to the city, which then meant that British businesses, if they'd created something that was good, would, as a general rule, going to go elsewhere in order to obtain the funds to keep working whatever they were working on, whilst it wasn't making the money that the city demanded very, very quickly. So therefore, what you had is this economic, fiscal, financial aspect that actually didn't sit hand in glove with, if you will, the industrial element. Whereas the German Wirtschaftswunder was built on industry, an industrial capacity of an underdog who'd been defeated, had a lot of technological skill, and had to utilize that technological industrial capacity to bring itself up. Out with, in many ways, the economic system, which was controlled and run by the Brits and the Americans. Right? In reality, by the American, but the system had been put in place. Bretton Woods, we helped put it in place. It was the death of Britain as an empire, but we still had that understanding, if you will, of how finances worked via the 200-300 years of, if you will, fiscal exploitation that the United Kingdom had done via the colonies. So that was still in place. In other words, the banking system worldwide had been put in place, and that built on top of that. Just the Americans were running it then. So that reality, that city reality, was again put on steroids in the late 80s, 90s, and that was what aided the small number of individuals to become wealthy. But, there was a trickle down to some extent, and you found your new buildings coming in Canary Wharf, or certain parts of London were rebuilt, etc., 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 based on that wealth. But that trickle down didn't go everywhere by any means, and so you had the northern losses because the industry had gone. Yeah, because the industry was no longer competitive, because the colonial industries weren't being held down anymore. The colonial markets weren't automatic anymore. Right. Now, Germany didn't have that advantage. So Germany had to produce. They had to make the best in order that people wanted them. That people wanted the best vehicle, BMW, Mercedes, Audi, VW, whatever it was. People wanted, German, brilliant. Made the best trains. Fantastic. The Intercity Express, ICE. Yeah. We want that because it's super. Oh, that maglev that the Germans have built. Blah, blah. Oh, yeah, we'll have some of that. Oh, we'll have the German engine. Oh, we want the German cooker. We want the German fridge. We want the German TV. Right? Because they were saying they were the best. Why were it the best? Because they had to make, the German optics, even down to optics. The Germans are knocking out the best. Why? Because they had to compete. We didn't need to compete. We'd lost the competition perspective. If we were selling to India, a British colony in the old days, and still until 1947, if we were selling to India, India had to buy. It couldn't buy from anywhere else. It was a locked-in market. And even after India changed, it didn't automatically just spin over and say, oh, we'll pick up the best. No, they had all vehicles, all Morris Minors, whatever they were. And they basically had to make those cars still function for quite a while. So you still bought them. You still had to buy the train from Britain because, they need the spare parts to run. And these are the ones that we had. We couldn't buy new, so we'll have to still buy from the British. And that went for the whole, I use India because it's obviously one of the biggest places, but that goes for the whole of the colonies that were still part of Great Britain. And those colonies that left takes 20 to 30 years to fall off and to then create your own substitute. That substitute now happens to be China. So what I'm saying is that the colonial perspective, which was very positive for the United Kingdom, became its weakness and its hangover. And yes, you got 30 more years out of it, we did. And fiscally, we got many more years out because the banking systems were put in place, which all these countries still had to run to. And in many cases, the, if you will, legal systems, the judicial systems were British. So you defaulted to Britain judicially. So that meant that your contractualization was British, right? Because of the colonial system. Don't forget, 1/3 of the world was British. Yeah, the empire took 1/3 of the world, ran it, and 1/3 of the world's population, British. Okay? And Great Britain was only the smallest part of it, a percentage of it, right? So this is the strength of the empire, but it's the weakness of the empire, because once it goes, because you could sell, frankly, rubbish to the empire, right? Once it goes, and people then wean themselves off the rubbish, as I say, with spares, etc., then we're going to buy the newest stuff in. We're going to buy the German vehicle. That was the German strength. Its capacity, its skill base, and its treatment of its people as you too are part of this economic wonder. You too will get every piece of the pie. Not like in Britain, whereby the hang-up from the class system, still to this day, was in place, and there's a small trickle down. No, in Germany, you will receive it all, because the people making the new systems were themselves not of any particular class. Not of any particular, they were the ones who were educated maybe, or they were the ones who thought up the ideas, or they were the ones who went out and made it happen. Right? So that, if you will, freeing up of capacity, of capability, without there being a class angle to it, whereby you got to look and say, oh, yeah, but is he really known? Is she really known? No, they were where they were. And that was their capacity. I hear a lot of women turning around saying, oh, we weren't allowed to work. On British TV, watch it every day. Oh, we weren't allowed, women are now in the workplace. This is total and utter nonsense. Working class British women were always working. You couldn't feed your family without it. It would be impossible to feed your family without the working class woman working. Where do they think the factory women come from? Right? The middle classes now didn't work because the goal of their husband was to make enough money, because he'd made it, he was in the middle class, that his wife didn't need to work. So that small number of middle class are the ones that argue that we weren't able to work. They were able to work, and frankly, working damned hard in factories. Okay? And had always done that. It's not a matter of Second World War or First World War. They'd always done that. If you want to look at British history, you'll find them dragging carts around in the mines with children at 9 years of age. Right? You'll find them drying kippers forever and a day when the sailors come in, the fishermen come in. Every bit of British industry, you will find the women were involved in it, the working class women working. Yeah? Because the problem is people selectively look at history. You know, it's like you turn around and people say, oh, you know, suffragette movement, men could vote, women couldn't. Rubbish. The working class British man could not vote. Okay? You had to be a property owner, or you had to be able to have a rental that allowed you to have a level and of a certain class, blah, blah, blah. Right? So the vast majority of men could not vote. And the suffragette movement, in its initial stages and the Pankhursts, etc., what they sought, and you only need to look at a movie like Mary Poppins. I know it sounds crazy, but movie like Mary Poppins to see it. What they sought, the middle-class woman, was the right for middle-class women, like middle-class and upper-class men, because what you're talking about, men of a middle to upper middle-class men, right? Upper middle-class women wanted that vote. They didn't ask for the vote for working-class women. It wasn't universal suffrage they were looking for. That's a misnomer. It was for women of their class. Because the conceptualization was, and Churchill even articulated it, was that actually the normal Brit isn't bright enough to vote. And by the way, what you need to understand is because there was never, up until about 1968, a British citizenship. I'll say that again. There was never a British citizenship, right? The people who came here from any part of the empire, okay, could then vote. Because any person from any part of the empire had the right to come to the mother country. You know, a Roman situation. You know, just the same as in Rome. You know, people have this misunderstanding that Rome is Italian. No, Rome is from any part of the empire, and indeed in not even the latter stages, the mid stages of Rome, right? You could even argue to the extent that many of the powerful individuals weren't in any way, shape, or means Italian or even European. You know, you've got African emperors, you've got emperors from all over the place. In Rome, any part of Rome that they took. Just as I mentioned to you last week, that in the Soviet Union, they were by no means just Russian. And many of the leaders like Stalin were not Russian. Stalin was a Georgian, example. Khrushchev was a Ukrainian, example. Right? So this is what happens when you get overarching systems, empires. You know, you can get the people from anywhere. Literally from anywhere, running anything. Because in some areas it becomes a meritocracy or just a capacity. You know, so you can have example an Ethiopian guy who was enslaved when he was young, then given to Catherine the Great as something of interest. And this guy then ends up as the generals in charge of the Russian armies back in the era of Catherine the Great. Why? Because number one, race really didn't matter in that sense. But two, it's because capacity is what mattered in the end. And if you had the assistance, the backing of somebody with power, you too became powerful. Right? That's it. That's what it was about. Patronage of power. People seem not to understand this. You know, the great Alexander Pushkin, one argues one of the greatest Russian writers, it is his grandfather I've just told you about. Okay? That black geezer was his grandfather, who became the head of the Russian military. So this is what happens. And this is what I'm saying is with Germany. And the reason why I mentioned and brought race into it, because that professor, that Colonel McGregor, as I spoke to, he kind of says things like, oh, these people who came to Germany will never be Germans. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. Anybody can be anything. Anybody can be indoctrinated to anything. Anybody. They can be part of any system. Because all it takes is for you to believe, want to be part of the patronage and be part of the system. You can be it. You can be more, whatever than the other person. And definitely within 2 or 3 generations thereof. I mean, these are the same people, Colonel McGregor, and as I said, I totally respect the guy. He's a great military individual. But these are the same people who call themselves American. The only American, if you want to do that, is the Native American. But then that would be silly, wouldn't it? Because what about all the people who've been born in America? I'm talking about the United States now. Yeah? And, another factor that one should understand, and the reason why I'm going around the world a little bit, because I'm trying to explain this idea that people now have that, Germany's fallen because it's got a load of people in who are not Germans. What is a German? The German people have come from all over the place. It's the same way, example, with taking that America angle further. If you want to talk about Christopher Columbus, right? Half of his crew is mixed race. The Moors had conquered Spain for 700 years. These were black guys coming in, and women, black men and women, but mainly the men, coming in from Africa. And North Africa is not what it is today. So this is the other misnomer. People see this idea of North African today, much, much lighter skinned, and think that's the way it's always been. No, it wasn't. Okay? Because there's a system, and you can look it up, there's a system that said a Moor, and Moor meant black. When it wasn't a black person, they'd call them a tawny Moor, like you get tawny wine, lighter skinned, light wine. And that's how they explain people who did not look black, tawny. And in Britain, we went a step further because we even call the Moor a blacker Moor. Okay? Because that's the way it functioned. So what I'm saying is that those people who went across to the Americas from Western Europe, which weren't the first people there by any means, weren't the first people that travelled there, half of them, if not more, were black, mixed race people, which the Americans would later in later years call black. Right. At least half of them on the first ship. Columbus probably even had some mixed race in him because of where he's from. Right. So that's how easy it is for you to become the people that you are. That's how it works. So for people to articulate the fact that Germans cannot become Germans, it's nonsense. Total nonsense. And I mention this because this is what's been pushed in Germany, and it's been pushed in the United Kingdom and in various other places. Right? And in doing that, what it means is that you undermine a segment of your people from which genius can come. If you want to look at the AstraZeneca situation and the people who created the Impfstoff, say in German, I've just forgotten the English name, they were Turkish Germans. And they just said, we're Germans. So you were getting injected into you a discovery by Turkish Germans who happened to be working in Britain. And they were just put up as Germans. So this nonsense about you can't become part of the system is a total lot of rubbish. So it's important to understand that, because this is the message that's been pushed in the United Kingdom with your Tommy Robinsons, etc., etc. Okay, and you will always have people who want to do it their own way. You know, throughout the whole of the British colonies, very few Britons ever turned around and said, well, we're going to just act just like them from wherever they might be. They said, no, we're going to bring with us our British way. So the British Raj in India, right? We'll bring our British ways. But to be fair, even in the British Raj, many of them, you know, some people call them subsequently Anglo-Indians, many of them took on Indian traits and in many ways became more Indian than British, if you will, whatever British is and whatever Indian is. Okay? Because again, all these places are all mixed. All of them. So Germany right now, you got AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, is now pushing this position that, you know, only true Germans, whatever that is, should be part of the system. And I'm just wondering whether that will play into another dead end for Germany. The problem is that it can't be worse than the guy you've got running it now, Merz, the conservative guy from the CSU, from the German Conservative Union. So this is where we find our problem. But it's the economy, stupid, as Bill Clinton once said, it's the economy, stupid. Right? That is the reality of the situation. If the German economy keeps falling, this is where the problem will keep manifesting itself. And basically what I'll do is I'll play you a few elements of the German economy and how it as and is changing over the years previously and for sure into today, how it's lessened its capabilities due to the lack now of cheap energy. So, ladies and gentlemen, listeners, thanks for listening this week, and we'll get back to the discussion next week. See you then.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.